We're going to take this discussion to another level because we have a high-level conversation coming up right now in this room exploring the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine and what it means for the EU's internal security. It's my great pleasure to introduce a journalist, a fellow journalist whose work I read regularly in Berlin, Christoph von Marschall, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the German daily newspaper, Der Tagesspiegel.
Yeah, and it's my great pleasure to welcome here Ylva Johansson on the stage, the European Commissioner for Home Affairs. And what we will do now, we try to think ahead a little bit. Of course, the war, the impact of the war is mainly on the citizens of Ukraine, and the citizens of the European Union are not the target of immediate fighting, but they feel the secondary consequences like energy prices, like inflation. The national conversation generally has changed. And now we would like to take a broader perspective and assess the short and long-term threats and how the EU can respond to it. And we would start just to make a list. Commissioner, what is mainly on your mind when you are thinking about the threats and consequences for home security inside the European Union?
Well, we have to recognize that the big threat is Putin. This is the biggest threat towards us. Of course, now he's invading Ukraine. He wants to destroy Ukraine totally. He wants to destroy the Ukrainians, but he is also destroying the international global order. And he wants to destroy the European Union. We should not be naive. This is actually his goal. So this is the biggest threat, and that means that the most important thing that we need to do in the European Union is to make sure that he will not win. So we have to stay united, and we have to be very strong, and we have to make sure that he will not win, because that will really be the big threat towards us. So this is the overall thing, and that means that we have to deal with he's using energy as a weapon. He's trying to divide us. He's trying to put a false narrative and propaganda on what causes this high energy prices. So this is the biggest thing. But then, of course, we also have to deal with other things like we have more than 4 million Ukrainian refugees. They are not a threat towards the internal security, but of course it's a challenge to deal with this. We have to deal with the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure, and I think we all think about it right now after the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. We need to be much more resilient, be much more aware of the huge risk that the critical infrastructure is posing on us, and we need to do more. And that was also clear from the speech from President von der Leyen today in Parliament. We need to recognize that a war is, of course, a catastrophe for citizens, but it's an opportunity for criminals. We will see organized criminal groups using this opportunity, trafficking weapons, trafficking people, trying to lure women and children, refugees, into trafficking, using them for sexual purposes or other purposes. They will try to traffic drugs. This, of course, we have to stay very vigilant on this topic. And the last thing I would say is that this is really an area where we need also to better protect our external borders. And this is, of course, something that we are already doing, but staying vigilant on how to protect our external borders is also important.
So we have a list of these things like critical infrastructure, like new opportunities for organized crime, human trafficking, firearms and drugs. So what can the EU do about it? Because often it's a mixed responsibility. It's not everything in the field of the European Union or the Commission. Sometimes you need to cooperate with member states. Then it's a question, for example, the critical infrastructure, is that more a military challenge or is it a civil challenge? So let's go through those points. Let's start with the critical infrastructure because it's on all of our minds. We just have seen how easily it can be attacked. And what can we do to protect this critical infrastructure?
We can do much more, and actually the Commission proposed almost 2 years ago a new legislation to protect our critical infrastructure in the European Union, and actually just before the summer the co-legislators agreed on this new legislation that will now be implemented. And for example, what we put in the legislation is that member states are not only obliged, today they are obliged to take into account 2 different areas, transport hubs and energy sector. Now we are broadening the scope to 11 sectors, like fresh water, food supply, a lot of other areas, cybersecurity, and also the steps that member states need to take. Why is this important on the European level? It's because that many of those critical entities are not only critical for one member state. If they are being destroyed, they have devastating consequences for many member states. And also that's why it's also important to make sure that we can restore as quick as possible. So we have a new legislation in place, and that member states and Parliament has been very happy to adopt, actually. So they see the need for a European approach here.
So we have a lot of social and economic pressure because people are economically more vulnerable, and you said that is an opportunity for organized crime. So how can we counter that? Of course, the easiest would say, well, let's make sure that no household has less money than before. Of course, that's not feasible. So what are the options to counter this kind of threat?
Yeah, we need to see that it's the organized criminal groups that are really using this. And the organized criminal groups, they are more and more professional. They are more and more international, and they are more and more violent. We see now that they are organized more or less like international, multinational business companies. And that's why we need more of police cooperation. So each member state, the police is doing a great job, but they can only see part of it, because most of those have links to other member states. And that's why the police cooperation is at the core. And that's why Europol is at the core. So we have recently now have a new mandate for Europol with bigger possibilities. Also, for example, to develop artificial intelligence to deal with information. Like, for example, you probably know about the Encrochat case, the Sky ECC, the Anom, where we had a lot of information on how these organized criminal groups works, but all these messages cannot be read by a policeman or policewoman. It has to be dealt with by artificial intelligence. It has to be dealt with together. We also know from this information that they very often target, they're using corruption. 60% of the organized criminal groups think that corruption is the best way to reach their target and their goals. And that means also that how we're building the resilience towards anti-corruption is really part of fighting the organized crime. But the short answer to your question is better police cooperation, quicker channels for the exchange of information, and a stronger role for Europol.
You made a very interesting remark about refugees. Of course, the war caused a lot, millions of refugees, and especially in this country, Poland. Poland has taken in a lot of refugees from Ukraine. But then you said, that's not a threat. That is a challenge. And of course, we understand what you are saying, but we have had conflicts before where we would have said, no, wait a minute, refugees can be a threat. When we had this mass of refugees from wars like in Iraq and Syria, of course there was this concern that it might also be an opportunity to smuggle in people who will be a threat for internal security. Has that changed? Is the structure of the war in Ukraine and the refugees which are coming so different from the refugees which were coming from Iraq, from Syria, and so on?
No, but we are much better prepared. I think this is important to see. The European Union is much better prepared to deal with a big refugee crisis. We are now facing the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And of course it's a challenge, but actually we are managing. And of course, some member states are taking bigger responsibilities than others. The country with the highest number of Ukrainian refugees per capita is the Czech Republic. Second is Poland. Third is Lithuania. So these are countries that really are taking a big, but we are dealing with this. And on this security thing, from the day one, We really reached out to the member states at the borders to make sure that they do the security check, even though it's difficult when so many people come, but they did. They did a security check on everybody entering into the European Union, and we sent support from Frontex, from Europol, to help with the second line and the third line of security checks. And yes, we found some people that try to use the opportunity to sneak into the European Union that are dangerous or potentially dangerous. But the borders worked. Actually, in this, the welcoming was huge and heartwarming, but the security checks were also there, and they worked.
So, of course, I have to ask, when you're talking about refugees, and it's a normal complaint that the EU member states haven't come to an agreement how to distribute refugees between them. Is that, how do I say that? Is that more an artificial complaint, or has it practical consequences when you said, you know, it works? Countries are taking in these refugees. It's not that they are refugees which they are not taken care of. So does it have to be the European Union? Do we need this agreement? Or can we say, if something is working, don't complain too much about the parts which could be better but are not really an obstacle?
Both yes and no. You know, when I was appointed commissioner, it's almost 3 years ago, and the main topic that I was given by Ursula von der Leyen was, you have to unblock the blocked situation on migration. And that has been my main topic. Because migration is something normal. Migration will always happen. Yeah? And our task is to manage migration in an orderly way, and we do that better together, and we do it also better together with third countries. And I've been working on this, and I mean, we are in a much better situation now. So now I have presented a new pact on migration and asylum, and it's being adopted step by step. And member states have a very constructive approach, and Parliament as well. And I think that was, we are dealing with, I should say, we're dealing with migration in a normal way. It's, if I can put it like, my aim was to make migration a normal, boring EU topic, to say that we should, I mean, member states have different opinions in many aspects, not only on migration, but most of the things we are dealing with in the European Union. And then, you know, we deal with it, Commission make proposal, member states make amendments, and they make compromises, and Parliament make compromises, and then we find an agreement that is maybe not perfect, but quite good. Yeah? And that's how we now are dealing with migration as well. So we are adopting part step by step, and that is going well. They make no headlines because we are actually adopting it. So it's not like, you know, the big conflict. And I think that was, it's a long answer, but I think that was the reason behind that it was possible this time to activate the Temporary Protection Directive. In my view, that should have been activated in the migration crisis in 2015, but the political situation was not there. This time, we had worked very hard to find a better understanding between member states, a better if not a consensus, but a better understanding on different views and different realities. And when I proposed to activate this directive for the first time ever in the Union, we had a unanimous decision 1 week after the war started. I think this was great, and this was really showing that we can deal also with very difficult issues together. And when we do that, we can be real proud of each other, and then we can manage things and challenges that are bigger than we thought we could deal with.
You were talking about migration, now we are talking about refugees, and of course the world would be much easier if it would be such a black and white thing. This is one thing, that's the other thing, and of course it is mixed, and it can also develop over time. So it is quite clear at the beginning of the war, people are fleeing the fighting in Ukraine, and they need, of course, a place they can go. But then comes the second chance, or this second part of the whole game, and they will be needed in Ukraine to rebuild the country. So what are your thoughts about handling that? To which degree could we also say that, you know, there's a time when you need help, and there's a time when the country, but all of Europe, needs some people to go back in order not cause a brain drain, which might be the obstacle for rebuilding those parts of the country which are not under war anymore?
people are going back right now. Quite a number of the Ukrainian refugees are going back right now. I was in Kiev 2 months ago, and I met with several of women that has been fleeing to the EU, and now was back in Ukraine, back in Kiev, rebuilding the country, going back to work, being part of the resilience, being part of the fight. So a lot of people are going back to Ukraine right now, and I think it's important with our message, go back. If things get worse, you are welcome back to the EU again. So this is actually happening right now. Then it's important to say that the Temporary Protection Directive is a temporary protection. So that will last until March 2024. So it's not a forever protection. Hopefully the war had ended and Putin is defeated then. But if not, then we have to have other solutions, because this solution has a limit in time.
You mentioned one more challenge, obstacle, however, and that is our borders, the external borders of the European Union. And again, it's a mixed responsibility. It is in the responsibility of member states at the external, but we have also Frontex, the agency, which is an EU agency. So you said that has improved enormously, but in the Mediterranean, for example, we still see a lot of problems which are not managed well or to a degree satisfactory. So what can be done to secure these borders, these external borders better? And is this mixed responsibility really an obstacle in practice? To which degree is it? What are your thoughts on that?
No, it's not an obstacle at all. We are now developing the integrated border management, which will be the most modern border management in the world, actually. So we are rolling out the coming years a very much higher ambition when it comes to the digitalization of our protection of the external borders. We will have much more information on everybody that will enter into the European Union, and Frontex is being building up and are working with more and more member states. So I really see a lot of progress in this area. But we also need to look at our partner countries. So for example, a few weeks after the war started, the Moldovan Minister of Interior called me, Anna Revenko, and she said, "Help! I can't protect my borders. I don't have the people. Can you send Frontex here?" Because that was how the criminals used that border, because it was a weaker one than towards the European Union. And then I said, oh no, negotiating an international agreement with Frontex takes usually 1 to 2 years in negotiations. And before that, we are not allowed to send border guards to a third country. But I said, okay, let's try. We finalized the agreement and the negotiation in 2 weeks. And the same day as I signed the agreement, Frontex border guards were actually coming to the borders, and they are doing a great job right now, helping Moldova at their external borders. So this is also important, how we work with weaker part, to say, that is also outside the European Union.
We have just 1 minute left, but I would like to raise an issue you started with. The biggest danger or threat at all is Putin, him in itself. He is trying to undermine us. He is trying to undermine the cohesion. And he is using tools like propaganda. So what is the best countering option for the European Union to counter this kind of propaganda that raises doubts in us, whether this is our war to fight, whether we should suffer inflation-wise, energy, and so on and so on. So what is your advice in that direction?
We have to fight this in many aspects, I must say. I was just having before this conversation with Google, and I think that the tech companies are important here, what they can do to counter disinformation and propaganda, but also that we need to have we are democracies. That makes, of course, that when people are having another opinion than the government, that makes sense that it could make the government lose, yeah? And that's how it should be. But that means also that we have to have a very broad democratic debate, and we have to speak out on the role of Putin. And I'm a little bit afraid that sometimes we are focusing too narrow on the problems that we are having, you know, and exactly close to me, like my high energy prices and other problems, the inflation. But we have to have a broader view to see what is causing this and what is the biggest threat. What is the biggest threat towards the energy supplies in the long term? What is the biggest threat towards the internal security in the European Union in the long term? So we really need to see where the real threat comes from, and we have to fight it together. So I think so far we have been much more united, much stronger than Putin thought that we should be. We surprised him, and we surprised ourselves a bit. And I think that we should continue to surprise ourselves, to show, because when we are united, we can do so much more than we think that we can do, actually. We can achieve so much more, and this is really what's at stake right now.
That would be psychological resilience of the whole society. Please join me in thanking the Commissioner Ylva Johansson, and I wish you a successful day. Thanks.